Hi everybody. This video is about setting up a skeleton for your character. I'm gonna hit the high points here. I'm gonna go through this kind of quick because there's a lot to cover. So please feel free to review this as much as you like. I also hope you're paying attention, taking notes in class, because we probably covered things in a little more detail there, although this will help you get through the entire process. So I'm in a side view here. I'm in the rigging menu set. And I'm going to go to skeleton and create joints. I'm going to check my settings here. Everything looks fine. You can just hit reset tool and that'll set it for you. So the way we create a joint chain is simply by clicking. We're creating joints as we go. I'm going to turn that up a little bit. If you need to ever change the size of your joint, go to display, animation, and joint size, and you get this slider and it'll make things bigger or smaller. And you can change these whenever you like. It doesn't affect the functioning of the joints, it just affects how they appear on screen. So we're in our joint creation tool, and as I click around the screen, it creates joints for me. Now I haven't actually created a joint chain yet. If I need to, I can back up through the chain just by hitting delete and replace another joint and then let go. And once I hit return, it creates the joint chain for me. And we can rotate these. This is a hierarchical relationship. The joint above the selected joint is the parent, and every joint below it is a child. So when you rotate those joints, the joints below them will follow. Another thing to be aware of when it comes to creating joints, if you watch this joint here, when I create this joint here, watch what happens to that little plus sign. See how it flips and it's now oriented down the bone length? See, that one did it too. This one will do it. See how it flipped there? The next joint in the chain orients the previous joint down the length of the bone, which is very important. You always need an axis that runs down the length of the bone so that you can rotate around that axis. So when we create our joint chain in our character, we're always going to create an additional joint at the very end of the chain that really doesn't do anything except orient the previous joint in the chain. Okay? So let me, that's a real quick overview of how joints are created. You'll get to see me do it a lot more here in just a minute. I'm going to go ahead and open up the character here. This is a little guy. He's not a really detailed character. His whole purpose is for us to get some practice putting joints in a character. He's on the Canvas site. You're welcome to download him and mess around with him if you like. Very simplified so that it's easy to see what's going on. When you're placing joints in a character, you cannot use the perspective view. The perspective view is a two-dimensional view into a three-dimensional world. So if we tried to place joints in here, Maya wouldn't know where in depth to place them. So anytime we're placing joints, we're going to place them in an orthographic view, and we're always going to pick the view that tells us the most about the contours of the character. So for example, when we're placing a spine or a leg series of joints, we're going to place them in the side view. When we're placing joints for an arm, we're going to place them in the top view because those views give us the most detailed information on where joints belong. Could we do it in the front view? Sure we could, but we wouldn't know where the foot goes, where the toe goes, for example. We could do the arm in the same as well, but the fingers become a problem. So we're going to go ahead and use our side view and our top view. Now, for placing the spine chain, the spine is really where we want to start because everything ends up connecting down to the pelvis joint. So again, I'm going to go to skeleton, create joints. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to place pelvis joint where I think it should go, and then I'm going to create some spine joints, a neck joint, a head joint, and then the top. And if you watch, as I release these, you'll see again that the previous joint flips around in orientation. Sometimes it's a big correction, sometimes it's a small one. but it always orients down the length of the bone as soon as I let go, so that there's an axis that runs all the way down the length of the bone. This joint right here is one at the very top of the head. Its only purpose is to orient the head joint. So there's our joint chain for the spine up through the head. When I hit return, it creates the joint chain. You always want to check the chain in another view. So here's the front view. I'm going to turn on X-ray joints so we can see what's going on. Even though it looks fine in the side view, we can see in the front view that that pelvis joint is a little too low. It belongs inside the character, and it's not quite there. So we're going to take it, we're going to slide it up here. I'm going to turn on wireframe on shaded so we can see where our edge loops are. And that's pretty good placement. But now if we look at it in the side view, you can see that everything's kind of misaligned a little bit. So we need to adjust these. The first instinct is to grab them and move them. Do not move joints. Never, never, never when you're placing joints do you want to move them. And that's because of that orientation that happened as we were creating the chain. If you move a joint, the x-axis no longer points down the chain. So what we need to do in order to get these into place is we're going to scale and rotate. So I'm going to take my pelvis joint here and I'm going to scale it down a little bit. And then I'm going to come up here to this joint. I'm going to scale that down a little bit. And I'm going to rotate this one. Kind of get this back where I want it to go. I'm using the up and down keys to move up and down the joint chain, where the up and down is up and down the joint chain, not up and down in the view. So it may look like it's doing it incorrectly at first, but when you think about it in terms of the parent-child relationship, the up and down moves us up and down the joint chain. I'm pushing the down key right now, even though we're moving up the joint chain. So I've rescaled these and I've put them in place and everything looks pretty good now. So here's our pelvis joint, and then our spine joints, our neck joint, and our head joint. The other thing you want to do as you go is you want to rename the joints as you go. So there's pelvis, here's spine 1, oops, spine 1, spine 2, spine 3, this is our neck joint, and finally our head joint. And why are we renaming them? Well, you can see that all Maya does is just stick a number at the end of every joint. So once the rig is complete, it makes it very difficult to figure out exactly which joint you need if they're all numbered. Joint 1, joint 2, joint 47, joint 162. This one I typically call head end, just to let me know that that's an end joint that we don't actually need. We could actually just delete this joint, and in fact, in game engines, that's what you'd want to do because there's a joint limit. But for our purposes, it's fine. So there's our first joint chain. We're going to get our tool back by pressing the Y key. You can see there's our tool back, and now we're going to do our leg chain. We're going to start with the hip and go down to the knee. And by the way, I can click and hold and drag and move this around as much as I want until I get it exactly where I want it to be. Then I'm going to go to my ankle, little foot joint right there, toe and a toe end. I'm going to go to my animation display and reduce the joint size just a little bit so I can see the bone a little better. Return to set. There we go. That's going to be hip left. And I'm putting the LT in there. I'll show you why in just a minute. Knee left. Ankle left. Toe left. Oops, sorry. Misnamed that. That's foot left. foot left, toe left, and finally toe and left. There we go. I'm going to check this in the front view. You can see that the leg is right in the middle between the two legs. When we create a joint chain in an orthographic view, we're using the Y and the Z to place them in space. Maya doesn't know where to put it on the x-axis, so it just puts it on the 0 point of the x-axis. We'll just take this and move it over so it's in the middle of the leg. The only time you can move a joint is when it's the very top joint in the chain. Any other time, you cannot move a joint if you want it to rotate correctly. So we'll leave that where it is, and then let's go and do our arm. Hit Y to reselect my joint tool. I'm going to create a clavicle joint back here towards the back. We need that to move the arm completely up. Then we'll go here for our shoulder, elbow, wrist, and then I'm going to zoom in on the wrist a little bit and show you a little trick here. We need to go down the fingers. He's only got 2 fingers, just for simplicity's sake. I'm going to go ahead and run some joints down this finger, these 2 here, and then an end joint. Now, I need I need joints in this finger and in this thumb. So the way I can do this without making it too complex is just hit the up arrow until I get back to the wrist joint, and then keep creating joints. And I'll go back up again. I'll come down here to the thumb, and thumb, and thumb. Enter. And once again, we're on the 0 axis. This time, it's on the 0Y. And we're going to take this, we're going to move it up into the arm. And you can see here that the hand is tilting down a little bit, so the fingers aren't within, the finger joints aren't within the fingers. Now we can come into the perspective view, and we'll turn on X-ray joints so we can see where things are. And we can rotate these so that they end up within the hand. So I'm going to take this, turn on my rotate tool, and grab only one axis handle, rotate that down, move around it a little bit, make sure that it's in the center, as close as I can get it. I'm going to take this, and I'm going to rotate it down. Again, checking around, moving around it, make sure that everything's lined up well. And the same thing with the thumb. These joints are a little big, so I could reduce them again if I wanted to. Display, animation, joint size, and reduce those down a little bit so that they look a little nicer. Okay. So there's one thing we want to do here. If we take a look, here's our wrist joint. And it's not really very well aligned with the wrist. If we take a look here, you can see that the rotation is going to kind of flop into the arm a little bit, and we don't want that. We want it to rotate straight down, aligned with this joint. So we're going to go into what's component mode. It's component mode like you'd use with vertexes and whatnot, except this is specifically for joints. So I'm going to press F8 on my keyboard to go into component mode. It tells us component selection is now on. And then I'm going to click on this little question mark here. And that allows us to adjust the, whoops, I got the wrong thing. No, don't want you. Want joints. There we go. I got out of component somehow. There we go. And what I want to do is I want to rotate my axis. So I'm going to just use the same rotation tool, select my object, and when I rotate this, whoops, wrong axis, I'm going to turn this so that that little plus inside the bone, inside the joint there, lines up with the bone length. And then F8 again. And now I've changed the rotation axis of the joint so that it lines up with the bone. Now all of this manipulating and changing and whatnot has introduced rotations into our joint chains that we don't want. You see here I've got a rotate value of negative 19 degrees. So before we continue, I am going to select all of my joints, and I'm going to go to Modify, Freeze Transformations, and that zeroes everything out. So now if I select on this again, you can see my rotation value is 0. Okay, so we've done half of the skeleton. We could do the other half really quickly by selecting the joint chain, and we're going to connect all of these up in just a sec. Selecting that joint chain, we're going to go to Skeleton, Mirror Joints, and our option box, and we want to make sure when you come in, it'll probably look like this. And we want to make sure we're mirroring across the appropriate axis. So we're going to mirror from here to here. So we take a look at our widget down here and see which two axes make up that that vertical. And we find that it's the YZ, so we're going to mirror across and select YZ. And the other place, here's why we threw LT in there. We're going to go LT, search for LT, and replace with RT. And we'll mirror this across. And now we got a series of joints here. And look at that, hip right, knee right, ankle right, foot right, and so on, all the way to the end. We can do the same thing here with our arm joints. If I just hit G, it'll flip that over too. But look what's going on with the arm. Joint 27. We move down, 2, 3, 4. And now we've got multiples of 2 and 3 and 4. So which one is which? That's why you want to rename stuff as you go. Okay. So we've got these 5 joint chains. They're all independent of each other. Excuse me. We want everything connected to the pelvis joint. So this part of it is really simple. You've probably done a little bit of this before. If not, it's really easy to do. We're just going to parent everything together. So we select what we want to be the child joint. In this case, it'd be the hip. Hit Q so I don't have a manipulator. Select, hold down Shift, click on the pelvis joint, and just hit P on the keyboard, and that parents it together. And you can always tell what the relationship is between the joints. The large end of the bone always is at the end where the parent is, and the small end of the bone is always where the child is. So if you select them in the wrong order and parent them, you can tell that this is not parented correctly. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that. Select the child, select the parent, hit P, there we go. Same thing up here. Select the child. This is my, I want to connect to spine 3, so I'm going to select this guy, shift select that, P, select that joint, shift select the spine, hit P, and now everything's parented together. We got a complete skeleton. We can rotate things. If we rotate the pelvis, everything rotates. If we rotate the clavicle joint, you can see everything below the arm rotates. And it's all connected up. The problem is it isn't affecting our geometry yet. So the next step is to connect it to the geometry. That's really simple. Okay, we're back. Sorry, I had to take a little bit of a break. Got a bit of a cold, started coughing. So we've finished out our skeleton, and now we need to attach it to our geometry. The way we're going to do that is by clicking on the pelvis joint and then shift clicking on our geometry, and then we're going to go to skin, bind skin, and our option box. And it's a really good idea to come into edit and hit reset settings. Other folks have been using the equipment, especially in the lab, and there may be settings set that you don't want. So the way we're going to bind this is we're going to go with a lot of the default. We're going to turn off some stuff though. We're going to bind to the joint hierarchy. We're going to bind closest distance. Classic linear is good. And we're going to turn off allow multiple bind poses, and we're going to take max influences down to 1. What this refers to is how many joints can influence a particular vertex when you do the binding. We're going to go ahead and spread some of the influence out over the rest of the model in a process called weight painting that we'll talk about next week. But initially we want max influences to be at 1, and what that means is only one joint will affect any vertex on the object. So it'll be 100% influence from a particular joint to a particular vertex. That's important when you're rigging, you do your initial bind, because if you have multiple influences, sometimes it's hard to get things in balance and get them exactly the way you want it. This makes a very harsh bind, but it allows you to smooth out the values a lot more quickly. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to turn off maintain max influences, because later on we're going to want to have vertexes influenced by multiple joints, say in the elbow and the wrist and the shoulder and whatnot. We're going to want to spread that influence out over multiple joints so that things deform nicely. But for our purposes in binding, we're going to be at max influences 1, and we're going to turn off maintain. And then we're going to hit bind skin, and our model changes color. And now if we click on a joint, we can rotate that joint. You can see that the model follows along. Some of the deformations are a little weird, and that's because we used a max influence of 1. You can see here that his upper chest is pulling away. One that always goes badly when we bind is right here, where we got a collapse and a stretch of the pectoral muscle. But we'll fix that when we get to weight painting. So for now, stick with that maintain max influences, or max influences of 1, and turn off maintain max influences before you bind, and you'll be in good shape. Once you've got your skeleton bound to your character, then you're in good shape for this week. Next week we'll talk about taking some of the weight influence of individual joints and spreading them out so we get nice, pleasing deformations. All right? We will see you next week.